My name is Dean Harris, and I'm from Waltham Forest SWP. I was also the chair of Waltham Forest Unison when the fascists attempted to come onto the streets of Walthamstow 3 times, and 3 times they were knocked back. Thank you. I'm also an LGBT activist and a member of Unison. I'm going to let you know about the meeting. It's Laura Mars, who's an SWP member in... Is that Wakefield? Yeah, it is Wakefield. I thought Wakefield was a made-up place. Former lecturer at Bradford College and an EC member of UCU. And brilliant pamphlet Laura was the author of Pride, Politics and Protest. And if you haven't read that yet, there's copies here. There are also copies of other books, etc. over there. And one of my favourite books ever is Transgender Warriors, which I think is absolutely stunning book. The title of the meeting is Fight for Trans Liberation, Resistance and Solidarity. Laura's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to bring people in to chat. But anyway, with no further ado, over to Laura.
Okay, the piece of film that I just showed, which some people may have seen that before, fantastic piece of film. It contextualises what I want to say today. It was a film of Sylvia Rivera speaking at the 1973 New York Pride. And the backdrop to this is that Sylvia had been excluded from the platform, even though she had been one of the key fighters against police harassment at Stonewall, even though she'd been a founder member of the Gay Liberation Front and a founder member of Gay Activist Alliance. She was excluded because already in 1973 there was a process of marginalisation, really, of the more unacceptable parts of the gay liberation movement, particularly trans people. And Sylvia, I think we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to people like Sylvia, who was present at the most exciting period, really, of the 1960s. The movement that, the various movements against racism, against war, and so on, of which she was a part. She wasn't just about gay liberation. She was also a member of the. She was very sympathetic and spoke with the Black Panthers and other revolutionary groups and so on. We owe an enormous debt of gratitude. The one that, by the way, that came up just after that was on Marsha P. Johnson, who was a close associate of Rivera. They both together formed, she referred in her speech to STAR, which was Street, at the time it was called Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, bit of a cumbersome name, later became Street Transgender Activist Revolutions when it was kind of reformed, actually in the late 1990s, shortly before Sylvia very sadly died at the young age of 50. And what I wanted to do it was to start off what I'm going to say, really, partly structuring it around the 3 individuals who I think were absolutely key to the advances that we have made and involved in the struggles that delivered those advances. And as I say, part of my talk wants to be about them, but not only about them, but also about kind of where we are now and the situation we're in and how we've got there and the dangers and the possibilities that we have. So, that was, you can look at this stuff, it's there on YouTube. Go and have a look at it again. First time I saw it, actually, it shivers down my spine. It's such a cry of rage against what she was suffering and what particularly young, homeless, trans women in particular, but trans people in general, were suffering at the time. And I have to say, still suffer. And that's the important thing, isn't it? The things I think we need to think about here are listed here. I have quite a lot of these, and I'm going to run through them pretty quickly because I'm known for blathering on, so I'm going to try and focus it around these. The things we need to bear in mind: the greatest advances for LGBT plus people have been made as part of social and class struggles. They are not something that have dropped off a tree or been given out of the generosity of the ruling class. We've had to fight for what we have now, and there's a long way still to go. There is nothing permanent in capitalism except the processes of exploitation and oppression. What does that mean? Well, it means that which we've gained can be taken away. when we reach, when we move into crisis situations, when the system goes into crisis situations, what we've gained could be taken away, which is the argument that as revolutionaries we have, that we have to change the very nature of that society. We have to remove from power those who currently run the society. Fundamentally, if we want to guarantee our rights and our liberation, not just our rights, but our liberation as human beings. Thirdly, that transphobia is not something in people's heads. It is in their heads, but it's not from their heads. It's rooted in the system in which we live, in the way in which that system extracts profits, in the role of the nuclear family in that whole process. In other words, we promote and argue for a materialist explanation of oppression. Transphobia, exactly the same way as we argue about the material roots of racism, sexism, and so on. And finally, as I say, preempted this point, haven't I? But transliberation, not just equal rights, is what we should be fighting for. And Sylvia was one of those who was fighting for liberation, not just rights. And that in a sense became the dividing point in the movement in the 70s between those people who thought that what they should be doing is fighting for better rights, rights at work, civil rights, and so on, and that they could do that best through essentially accommodating with the system and by a reformist strategy. In other words, getting people into elected positions in city councils and so on and so forth in order to change legislation and so on. And people like Sylvia, who were arguing that actually what we should be about is liberation. Liberation for us as trans people, but also liberation for all people. Everybody's sexuality is constrained, isn't it, in all sorts of ways. Straight people's sexuality is constrained, as well as LGBT plus people's sexuality and gender expression is constrained by the system that we live in, the binary expectations in terms of gender and so on. And what that then comes down to, I know it probably should be the conclusion of the meeting, but here it is, up front, in case I forget. Transliberation, we need to overthrow the system, fundamentally. The three people that I think, I've already mentioned two of them actually, but they are worth having a look at in a whole number of ways. Leslie Feinberg has been mentioned. I know Sue mentioned Leslie in her meeting yesterday. I mean, it was, if you've read her book, Transgender Warriors, she wrote other stuff. She wrote a book on transliberation, she wrote a novel, and so on. But Transgender Warriors, I think, is explicitly written from a Marxist position. It goes way back, actually, into ancient history to look at forms of society, forms of organisation of how we live. And I mean, even to the extent of making the point, which I think is a very valid point, that you will come across strictures in relation to our sexual expression, our gender identity, how we dress, and so on, in the Bible. And there's an argument, again, I think Sue made this point in her meeting yesterday, why would you need these strictures and prohibitions if it was not to try and stamp out behaviour that in fact was actually, very, very common and previously accepted? If you were trying to force a code of behaviour on people, well, it's because people behave in those ways. And we know from our examination, anthropological examination of other societies, pre-capitalist societies, difficult to see there are any now, but pre-capitalist societies, that there were often a range of genders which were acceptable, not necessarily universally acceptable, but were accepted and tolerated and were not a big issue from that society's point of view. So that's Leslie. Leslie, I'll come on to again in a minute. Sylvia Rivera, I've talked about, a Latina trans activist, co-founded STAR. Helped found GLF and GNA, supported the Young Lords, which was, I think, a Puerto Rican anti-racist, anti-capitalist organisation at the time, and the Black Panthers. So it was I know there's a little confusing bit in that film, by the way, which is I am not in favour of revolution. I think what she meant was I'm not in favour of the sort of revolution you lot out there want, not that I'm not in favour of revolution. And she goes on actually to clarify that. And in the quotations that you find from her, she quite clearly says, I've got one that I'll show you later, I am a revolutionist. maybe not in the sense that we nowadays, understand that tradition, but certainly, wanting to tear the head off the system, she clearly was in the same camp as us. Secondly, Marsha P. Johnson. I always wondered what the P stood for, but she said, well, it stands for pay it no mind. In other words, I will present myself as I wish, pay it no mind. And she lived with Sylvia for a time, a black gay revolutionist. And all three of those lives, what's the importance of them? Well, they spanned that period of turbulence, really, in the mass struggles of the 1960s. Perhaps the kind of period that, we may be moving into again. And so this stuff is, even more directly relevant. They span that period from when, really the trans movement emerged from out of the lesbian and gay movement. I mean, there was no real acknowledgement at the time of the involvement of what we would now regard as transgender people in the Stonewall riot, for example. It was kind of, lesbians and gays and trans people were actually part of that, very much part of that, as Sylvia was, but it wasn't really an acknowledged role until much, much later, when the sort of transgender movement began to emerge as an independent sort of movement, perhaps in the sort of, really, I guess, not until really the late 80s and early 90s. They all identified, not just in terms of being trans, but actually with all the oppressed groups, and they considered themselves revolutionaries. There's a great quote from Sylvia Rivera who says, we had fought against racism, we fought for women's liberation, we fought against the Vietnam War. Now, after Stonewall, it's our turn, to fight, to organise and fight back. And they were all, as I say, part of the radical birth of modern LGBT plus and transgender liberation movements. And as I say, they had a broad front of resistance. This is Sylvia Feinberg. She died fairly recently. Died fairly recently, 2014, aged 65. All three of these people, by the way, arguably died from the effects of transphobia. So Leslie died from complications arising from Lyme's disease and other things picked up from tick bites. And she said she had not had appropriate health care. She was discriminated against as a transgender person in the American healthcare system and on occasion refused treatment. And that contributed to her relatively early death. Her final words were, hasten the revolution, remember me as a revolutionary communist. She was not part of the tradition we are in, but she was a revolutionary Marxist, and she wrote quite clearly and openly as a revolutionary Marxist with a materialist analysis of the oppression that she and others have suffered from. This is the march. After this march, this photograph after this march is when Sylvia made her speech. Marsha Johnson is on the left there with the cooler. And it was an angry speech. It's an incredibly angry speech against the organisers of the, if you like, the emerging official lesbian and gay movement at the time in New York. And that's just a photo I came across. Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha died in unexplained circumstances at the age of 48. Her body was found in the Hudson River. It never been investigated. The police put it down to a probable suicide. But people had seen her being harassed. It was on the eve of the New York Pride. Had happened on that day, and she'd been harassed during the day. And there is speculation that in fact she could have been thrown in the river, but it's never been investigated. And Sylvia Rivera died again relatively recently, I suppose, from liver cancer in 2002 at the age of just 50. Liver cancer which had almost certainly been exacerbated by her problems with alcohol and drug abuse. As a result of the kind of poverty and the life that she was forced to live. Transphobia has a long history. This is something which I think is actually in Leslie Feinberg's book. It's a 1594 Theodore de Brie engraving of Balboa using dogs to murder two-spirit trans native people. And there's actually quite a lot of material from that time about how in the Americas there were a whole range of ways of living and sexual expression and gender expression which utterly shocked the conquistadors and the various invaders who sought to wipe it out. And they did that by taking these people who were often very respected people in their communities and literally throwing them to the dogs. So a long history. More examples of up-to-date stuff. Institutional transphobia in the US. This is, people may be aware of the C.C. McDonald campaign of a couple of, I think about 3 years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago, who was sentenced to 3.5 years in a male prison, she's a trans woman, for causing the death in self-defence of a transphobic bigot who attacked her. There was a knife fight, and it was the bigot who died, and not C.C. McDonald. And there was a big campaign. This is one of the big differences, I think, now to how it was, even 20 or 30 years ago around trans issues. There is the potential for, big campaigns, mass campaigns, and we'll see more examples of that as we go on. Another example of institutional transphobia, people will know these examples, I think, but the Tara Hudson, who was jailed in Bristol men's prison. There were 3, weren't there? 3 cases came up very quickly. Was it last year? Time passes so fast when you get to my age. Anyway, Tara Hudson was jailed in Bristol men's prison. Vicky Thompson killed herself in actually my local prison in Leeds at Armley, which is a male prison. And Joanne Latham also died in Woodhill prison. All of these, because the prison regulations allowed the possibility for trans people to be jailed in male prisons. So it was assessed on an individual basis. The only thing if you did not have a gender recognition certificate, okay, if you had a gender recognition certificate, you could go to the prison of that gender on the certificate. If you didn't have one, which of course many, perhaps majority of trans people don't have, then you risk being sent to a prison of the wrong gender. Those regulations are, I understand, under review, but who knows where that's going to go. Importantly, the campaign around Tara Hudson, did lead to her early release. That's the importance of campaigning, isn't it? These things can work, and we should do it. The prison regulations are under review. Okay. Gross examples of homophobia, transphobia. If anybody wants to read this stuff, really brilliant book, The Men in the Pink Triangle. 50,000 roughly LGBT plus people were killed in the Nazi concentration camps from the mid-1930s to 1945. The Men with the Pink Triangle. It's worth bearing in mind what I said earlier about how things can go backwards, because in the 1920s, in many German cities, there was a vibrant, gay rights, gay liberation movement, a gay social, gay social life, lots of gay clubs. Those, and you could, it was there were major advances, weren't they? People could go to the cities and could find people that they could socialise with, mix with, and so on and so forth. Something that hadn't been possible in quite the same way before that. Within 10 years, many of those same people were, being denounced to the Nazis, were ending up in concentration camps or in prisons, and over the period of time, 50,000 people were executed, summarily executed, murdered, worked to death, and so on. And many of the people who were in those prisons at the end of the Second World War remained in prison after the liberation, after the end of the war. Some of them were still in prison 5 and 10 years later. That's the extent of the homophobia which continued. This is just another example. the Nazi takeover in 1933. Loads and loads of outrages, but there was, the book burning. Let's get rid of any kind of evidence that there had been any rights and potential for liberation beforehand. This is reputed to be book burning the books from Karl Hirschfeld's Institute, which had been set up just after the First World War, and in which the first sex change, sex reassignment operations were carried out. So, that's what happens when you let the Nazis... Okay. It is undeniable that there is much greater visibility of transgender people these days, for all sorts of reasons, which I'm sure people can discuss after the meeting and the discussion. But some of them, I've just bunged up a load of examples here. People will have heard, I imagine, of Caitlyn Jenner, of the Kardashian clan. I never watched this. It was news to me. I've never heard of the Kardashian clan really before. But anyway, Caitlyn Jenner was the kind of patriarch, I think, of that group of very rich people who seem to do nothing but get filmed and wear things, which is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, none of us can do this, can we? We can't wear things. But anyway, Caitlyn Jenner and Kelly Maloney, who was a former, still is actually, a boxing promoter, who the quote I found from Kelly Maloney was that she had used buy-to-let to pay for the £100,000 sex change. She sold part of her buy-to-let portfolio in order to pay. Oh, it's shocking, isn't it? I mean, she lost part of her portfolio. I mean, if we lose part of our portfolio, it's like you lose your pension, or you lose your you get the benefit cut or whatever. That's our portfolio, or your wages slashed. But no, she sold some houses to get her sex change, as she put it. She was also, by the way, a UKIP candidate. Did you know that? Yeah, she was a UKIP, and she went to the last UKIP conference. She did at least have the grace to apologise for the homophobic comments she made about parts of London when she was campaigning, but nonetheless, very dodgy politics, comrades. There are other, recently famous trans people from more modest roots. Janet Mock, for example, multi-award winning book Redefining Realness, been a big hit in America, you may have seen it. And Laverne Cox, if you've seen Orange is the New Black, Laverne Cox is one of the actors there, and also made the cover of Time, which was entitled The Transgender Tipping Point. And the suggestion that there was so much publicity around now that that things had tipped in favour of transgender people and away from transphobia. That, of course, is the open question, isn't it? The vast majority of trans people are, live marginalised and poor lives, and not just actually in the developing world. There are 30 US states that have no anti-discrimination protection for trans people, and I haven't got time to really go into this, but there's the backlash going on, isn't there, around the bathroom laws, which started off in North Carolina, which have included somebody planting a pipe bomb, in a toilet. And you should have a look at this stuff. There's I did post it on my Facebook site. There's a fantastic rant by a young woman who, who was actually kicked out of a toilet by the police, a women's toilet by the police. And she has a real rant because actually she's straight, and she looked like she might be trans, so she was kicked out. And there are a whole bunch of examples of this. And of course, what this stuff has done is make it actually worse for cisgender women who are now being scrutinised by store detectives. Do you look feminine enough to go into the women's toilet? And there's cases of men following women in, saying, you're a man, bizarre stuff. The woman actually who has this rant says, well, actually now I understand the harassment that trans women have suffered for so long, just trying to go for a pee, you know. So anyway, yes. Moving on quickly. How much has really changed is a legitimate question to ask. There have been some interesting, even quite recent studies. There's a government study, for example. Over 80%, I've just picked out various things. Over 80% of trans respondents avoided certain situations due to fear. 38% had experienced sexual harassment. 6% had been raped because they were trans. 88% were currently or previously depressed. 53% had self-harmed, 35% over a third had attempted suicide at least once, 52% had problems getting or keeping work, 19% reported being homeless at some point. That's pretty current stuff, all right? So, you know, there's lots of examples of this. Before Stonewall, I wanted to run through some examples of collective resistance before Stonewall. There were struggles which were really straws in the wind to what would happen at Stonewall and after. The first of those was actually at Cooper's Donuts. It's called the Cooper's Donuts riot, Los Angeles, 1959, and it was a donut cafe that tried to stop trans people meeting. They had nowhere else to kind of go. You know, they were banned from other cafes and so on, and they kicked off. I just love that sign. Sorry for the inconvenience. We're trying to change the world. I think we should have that on our picket lines. Sorry, changing the world here. So there was that. There was perhaps a better known one called the Compton's Cafe riot. Because you can't read that properly, I've put it on there. It marks the site. It's gone now. It's Compton's Cafeteria. A riot took place when transgender women and gay men stood up for their rights and fought against police brutality, poverty, oppression and discrimination in San Francisco. And actually, that went on for several nights. Actually, they did win. They had limited gains out of that. They won some citizens' rights out of that struggle, which was, you know, again, emphasises the importance of that collective fight back with allies, you know, to win the demands. And then, of course, there's Stonewall. I think it's from the Martin Duberman book. The 1960s brought huge social movements against war, racism and sexism and kicked off the fight for gay and trans liberation. Moving on quickly again, mid-1970s. Important period is the 1970s because it marked, as we saw with the film, from about 73 onwards, you can trace this, the kind of ebbing, if you like, of that liberatory wave into a kind of a compromising with the system, into a reformist sort of strategy for trying to win changes and advance. And you know, from that period, you know, that you can tie it to the declining class struggle which took place after 74 in this country, for example, the drop-off in terms of class struggle. You know, that 74, the miners beat the Tories, actually. You know, they drove a government out of office, but subsequently there were those compromises being made by the leadership of the trade union movement and so on. And it was a period of cuts and crisis, but also the initiation of neoliberalism, and it didn't come from nowhere. The point about neoliberalism is it's an attempt to restore the profitability of the system by attacking workers' rights and the share going to pay and so on. And from that sort of period, there was also, perhaps the late 70s and the 80s, an anti-transgender discourse emerged within the sort of LGBT plus movement. Reagan's cuts. I mean, this was a period of, the emergence of AIDS and HIV/AIDS and so on. And, you know, trans was essentially being described as bad or sick or wrong. And there was a strand. Be careful here, because not all radical feminists are trans exclusionary by a long chalk, but there was a radical feminist strand with Mary Daly and Janice Raymond, of which there are echoes today still, unfortunately. There was a picket recently of trans exclusionary radical feminists outside Congress House where they are taking evidence for the inquiry on trans rights. I don't know if you saw that, but there was a picket saying, you know, ban trans women from women's spaces, you know, etc., etc. There's a whole debate emerged, really, particularly around questions of reproductive rights issues, for instance, about just who is a woman, and how do you define maleness, how do you define femaleness, what is to be feminine, masculine, how is that linked? Well, it's a debate, I imagine, that we really do need to intervene in. In a sensitive, I think, but fairly kind of firm way. And that there are, these debates are going on now. And there was also the state refusal to fund AIDS research, which actually, condemned, literally, really condemned millions of people around the world to death. The failure to fund that has led to millions of deaths, and we shouldn't, this is homophobia. This is the impact of, that homophobia. The socialist tradition, quickly run through this. I think it's, we're kind of dealing with it in other meetings as well. But there is a long tradition of the left support for socialist support for gay rights and for gay liberation, really from the late 19th century, the early 20th, strongly linked to socialist individuals and organisations. I've only got time to mention a couple of them. People like Edward Carpenter, for instance, one of the founders of the ILP, early radical on these issues. Magnus Hirschfeld, member of the German Social Democratic Party, who only narrowly avoided murder by the Nazis by being out of the country when his institute was destroyed. And of course Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Now, it's important, crucial that we talk about Lenin and the Bolsheviks. I can't do it in any depth, and it will be done in other meetings. But the fact that what the Bolsheviks did, was to put into practice this notion of revolution being a festival of the oppressed, recognising that the most oppressed, will rise up and fight back. And what did they do? How did they follow that through? I've come across loads of activists in the LGBT plus movement who don't know this stuff because it's been lost, in the 1930s in particular. And it's important we know it, and we talk to them. The Bolshevik government repealed all laws outlawing homosexuality, removed the age of consent, legalised divorce, legalised abortion. Despite fighting a war for survival, a civil war for survival, dealing with famine and so on. And that was not just like a flash in the pan after the revolution. Hey, we've got all this. That was enshrined in the 1922 legal code. So like 5 years after the revolution, it was enshrined in that. I have to move on really quickly. A fundamental point I should have spent more time on, but Engels is key to this. It seems to me to our sort of explanation. Sexual and gender relations in society don't come from ideas in people's heads, but from the production and reproduction of immediate life, as Engels put it. In other words, how do we produce our means of subsistence? How we organise society? How is it organised in order to produce that? And the production of human beings themselves, the next generation of which the nuclear family is absolutely crucial. And that's why we go on and on about the nuclear family and the nature of the nuclear family. What should we be doing? Well, today's activists, we need to rediscover trans and LGBT history of struggle and resistance. And there have been lots of stuff written on this. I mean, if you read people like Jeffrey Weeks, for instance, and lots of really good stuff, about the history. Resistance, the crucial link really between trans liberation, class struggle, and the fight for socialism, as I set out at the beginning. We work with other oppressed groups, feminists, genderqueer, gender variant, cisgender people and groups, but also need to debate with them the limitations of identity theory, queer theory, intersectionality and privilege theory. Because those, I'd argue, mistaken views can lead you, they have practical consequences. Who do you fight alongside? If you follow a kind of radical identity theory approach, well, you're more interested, to be honest, in attacking other people's apparent privileges rather than uniting and fighting together. It has practical results. We reject essentialist and non-materialist approaches to gender and gender identity and sexuality. And there's a whole lot of work, I think, to be done in that regard. Finally, finishing off, I need to sum up now. I think the Pride film and what people have done around that, fantastic example of solidarity between, if you like, unlikely was going to say bedfellows there. probably not. Unlikely groups, But what an inspiring film that is. Absolutely fantastic. And what the comrades have been doing, in the last year or so around reforming that, so it's absolutely incredible. And a brilliant, shining example for us. Today's priorities. Well, actually, I tell you what, that statement that came out from LGBT plus against Islamophobia was fantastic. It was after Orlando. Absolutely spot on, quick, and said all the right things. And that, is the kind of thing that we need to be doing. The support for refugees, migrants and asylum seekers. Building united fronts against, transphobic laws, hate crime, discrimination and so on. Recapturing that process of seeking to recapture pride as protest and not, bloody corporate fund days. And of course, linking all that up with the fight the cuts and fight austerity. This is my last two quotes are here. From Sylvia Rivera, one of her statements she made, I think she was interviewed in about just not long before her death actually. I was a radical, a revolutionist. I'm still a revolutionist. I'm glad I was in the Stonewall riot. I remember when someone threw a Molotov cocktail, I thought, my God, the revolution's here. The revolution is finally here. And I think a slightly kind of more measured one from Leslie Feinberg, which is reminiscent of the kind of things that Engels said, for example. None of us will be free until we have forged an economic system that meets the needs of every working person. As trans people, we will not be free until we fight for and win a society in which no class stands to benefit from fomenting hatred and prejudice, where laws restricting sex and gender and human love will be unthinkable. And I think that's probably the point I should end. So, thank you.
I'm Kieran, but actually, who am I? Firstly, I'm human. That comes first and paramount. Secondly, I'm a comrade. And thirdly, I feel I am whoever I feel most comfortable as. And it's not a choice for some people. Some people go through a massive process of drugs and operations and that, and it's actually not a choice. It's who they are, and it's who they're most comfortable with. And actually, in a safe space like Marxism, we should all be comfortable being ourselves. Secondly, on safety, any problems, see the people in the red T-shirts. I'm Kieran, come up to us. If it's trivial, like you don't know where the room is, to you're being harassed, come up to us. We'll try and deal with it. If you don't feel confident dealing with it with yourselves, but actually, we're all a trusting support network, and we need to be there for each other. Thirdly, I forgot my prop. 1 second, excuse me.
Can I just say, this is not a turn,
Does anybody know what this is? No, good. All right, it's a Wipala. It's a Bolivian indigenous flag that was a rallying cry for the indigenous peoples of all different cultures, all different ways of living, civilizations that are all different, against the conquistadors and against fighting back. They're all equal, they're all different, and it's all part of the uniting and fighting and all that good shit. But lastly, I've got a announcement, which is I was on the Jeremy Corbyn anti-racism rally vigil thing yesterday. I'll finish very soon. And I met an openly gay Catholic priest from Ireland, and he's very interested in working with LGBT against Islamophobia. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Welcome. I've got to say that we are filming this. Sorry about that, Kieran, you're on camera, but anyone else who doesn't want to be, let us know. We might edit that, Kieran. Okay.
I was interested in Laura's remark about reference to radical feminists, some radical feminists' attitude towards transgendered people and the hostility there. I hadn't really been aware of the history of it. I became aware of it as an issue quite recently when somebody I sing with in an LGBT choir she's male to female, transgendered, and she posted on her Facebook a remark, on the face of it, humorous, slightly flippant remark relating to Germaine Greer's seminal 1970s book, the feminist book, The Female Eunuch. She She posted, "It's not fair. Germaine Greer said women are eunuchs, but eunuchs can't be women." Obviously referring to what Germaine Greer has been posting about it. And then I read a bit more about it, and it does sound quite horrific. But the other point about it is, as a reaction to it, I know at Cardiff University, where she was due to speak, she got no platformed. And I think that raises the whole question of when no platforming somebody is appropriate or not. Obviously, when someone's a danger, like fascists, we have advocated no platforming in the past. When it's someone whose opinions might be distasteful, but you don't agree with them, is that the most appropriate method? I have doubts about that.
Thank you.
It's just a question, really. Take about 30 seconds, I think. No, my eldest daughter runs an urban gay night in Birmingham called Urban Slag, which stands for straight, lesbian and gay, and I'm not kind of promoting it, although I feel like I am a bit. But it's for young black LGBT people. So you go into that event and it's kind of 98% young black people, really, and transgender people. And there's lots of discussions among my daughter and her friends about creating safe spaces for young black people because of the racism they face, as well as kind of homophobia and transphobia. And so kind of what they sort of do a little bit is sort of self-segregate themselves a little bit, and just because they still see the movement, despite all the progress and that's been made, is kind of dominated still by kind of white, not just white people, but middle-class people as well. And so I just wondered what your thoughts were about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there is some discipline today, isn't there?
Joseph, SWP Cambridge. Basically, I just want to say, in fact, how full of hope I am. Because I never thought we'd get to the position we are in my lifetime. Okay, I went to school in the 1940s and 50s as a gay schoolboy, and there wasn't even a word gay. I can't tell you what it was like to live through those times, and now I can live openly. I can feel much more safe than I ever did before. This doesn't mean we've sort of conquered everything, but we really have. What I'm so hopeful now is, what I find is that things like gender and sexuality, we're accepting that there's a fluidity. Because we were still expected to tick boxes of like gay, straight, whatever. And I'll just illustrate this quickly with two stories of two people I've grown up with. The first was Rosa, who was at the peace camps at Greenham Common. Rosa, I knew then. Rosa is now Paul. But in fact, before she was Rosa, she'd been a boy. But she was never upset about the changes, because she said that was me. That was my identity. I was a boy. I felt I was female. I now feel I'm male. The problem was that when she became a man again, as Paul, he had breasts. And he liked to go swimming. And he went swimming, and they ordered him out of the pool because he was in male swimming trunks with breasts. So he said, well, okay, I'll go into the female locker room and wear a bikini. Well, they said, you can't do that because you've got a penis. So he said, well, okay, then I'll go in the male's changing rooms and wear a bikini. Well, you can't do that either. I feel now he would win some battles, but the big hope, I was watching a program this year of three young men did a program on television. They had all been brought up as girls. And there was one of them who was 22, Jamie, and he told his story. He's engaged, he's got a fiancée, but he said, I'm keeping my vagina. And he said that usually throws people into consternation because people want to know what we do. He said, it's none of their bloody business. We do what we want to do. And okay, my fiancé has a vagina, I'm a man, and so do I. I have a vagina. Things have really moved on that people can now come forward on open television and talk about it. So I'm really hopeful for the future, folks. Keep battling.
Sorry to be the most pessimistic 26-year-old like ever, but I'm 25 soon. I don't even know my effing age. I am aged by this world so bad, but I'm not so hopeful. I want to be. oh Christ, do I want to be hopeful? I like to tell people I think there's going to be a trans riot again soon, because if there's not, I'm running out of ideas, to be honest. It isn't. We're nowhere near that. I don't believe we are anywhere near that. I don't believe, the fact that the forced surgery of intersex infants is still commonplace. The fact that I can still not get a passport, that we had to run away from Coventry because we couldn't get a GP, that this is literally now and every day, and pretty much everyone, there's so few trans people I know who have a job of any description, and usually the ones who do are people who transitioned a lot older and already got some kind of career sorted out when they were pretending to be cis. We weren't very good at it. None of us were very good at it. But usually enough to convince people. And so it's one of them. There's still huge steps that need to be made. And I think one of the things that we are lacking, unfortunately, is a lot of activists, a lot of comrades are still lacking knowledge and are lacking a lot of personal drive to go out and find that knowledge. I mean, yes, there isn't, unfortunately, huge amounts of books specifically on the subject, and Transgender Warriors is awesome. I got it recently. Yeah. But it's one of them I found, like, you talk to people, they don't know the very basics. They don't know what's going on. They don't know terminology. They don't know how things are gathering. And then it's very difficult to bring in new trans activists and go, people might ask you something really stupid really quickly. So it's one of them. I think the best way that we can be ready for what I hope is going to be the big riot soon is by getting ourselves educated, by making other comrades get educated themselves, and to be staunchly aware of how much we are lacking. I mean, at the moment, I think I'm actually a medical case study, because I've been refused hormone treatment because they want to know me better as a non-binary person. But a year and a half ago, I wouldn't have even gotten to the gender clinic. So we are inching, which is why I think it's going to snap, but we do have to be ready, and the encouragement to get ready needs to be from everyone.
Right, Anna from Manchester branch. Coming to Marxism this year, I was very pleased to find that we actually had in the pamphlet a gender-neutral toilet put down with its location after the previous year running around with homemade signs, putting them up on particular toilets. Just want to talk about a quick thing that I came here to. I came here today very early in the morning to find that the sign had been taken down, the sign that pointed to where the toilet was, and the actual sign that was on the toilet entrance had been taken down. It turned out it had been taken down by the cleaners, and it was quickly put up. But I just want to stress this to all the comrades here and anyone you speak about. If you hear anybody talking about taking the sign down, or you see anybody taking the sign down, inform the Marxist team, call these people out, because trans people, as we all know, we just want to use the facilities like everybody else, and we want to feel safe just like everybody else. And and so far we just have the one gender neutral toilet, but if a trans person walks into one that isn't the gender neutral toilet, no one here is going to try and police anybody's gender. Nobody's going to do that, because but if you see anybody trying to police people's gender or anything like that, please call them out on it. Thank you.
Everyone's been fantastically disciplined, so we're going to get a few in now. I've got lots, so please don't take personal offence if I don't call you, but I have got lots already, so I'm just trying to get through it.
Okay. I think, for me, the most fascinating thing about Leslie Feinberg's book is talking about a history that says, in the past, gender was seen as a very fluid thing, and how hard the state, wherever it was, actually fought to get rid of that. And I think, when people talk about ideas in people's heads and people aren't very confident or anything, I think we do have to think about the role of the state in perpetuating the idea that particularly women, I would say, have a particular role. I mean, I work in a school, and you walk into any little reception class and there they are being read Sleeping Beauty, who wakes up, is grateful and marries a prince. That that is a role that's set. There are arguments with children. They're very much set about, actually, do you know what? Boys like pink. Pink's a nice colour when you're a little kid. But very, very early on, gender is seen as something very specific. And so I think that really ties in with how do we fight this? Riots are absolutely brilliant. Frankly, I'd like a good riot in about half an hour, But I think in terms of how do we fight for liberation, which is what Laura was talking about, we have seen a low level of class struggle. When we look at Pride and the those lessons weren't lost, were they? The fact that, gay rights were put on an agenda which had been, even in the Labour movement, had not been discussed because of that solidarity shown in the miners' strike. We live in incredibly exciting times, actually. We live in times where, the leader of the Labour Party is being attacked massively by the right, but is actually standing up for all the rights, for refugees, for gay rights, and a whole load of people actually want to be part of that. I think the question is, the state will fight that. We're seeing that in every single direction at the moment, aren't we? And Laura's right about the rights that we have got can be undone. We have to fight incredibly hard now and link all those different things so that we actually fight for the sort of society we want where everybody can be themselves.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Murfat from Birmingham branch. I just take this opportunity really to thank people who work really hard, like Jeff and other people, to start up LGBT against Islamophobia. I think it was very, very important, and it was already established. And then, whatever happened in America, so we had that tool to break that. Backlash probably on the issue. The other thing is I just wanted to let people know that there is a lot of push in the Muslim community to put a Muslim against gay in terms of using the CHIP program, and there's a huge push on that. And we've been through a lot of things in Birmingham as well, trying to diffuse sort of opportunities. So I'm not quite sure who's pushing for that, but probably we can guess. The thing is, I could feel it's very important to have Muslim against homophobia, and I would really like to talk to comrades probably in the party that we need to start something, because it come a day that we actually need to have that platform, as a Muslim, not just in the party or probably a bigger thing, but we need to have that foundation to start up something, because there is a lot of push to put, gay issue against Muslim or whatever. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you.
You see, a while ago, I think people within the gay movement were talking about the fact that, well, you've won gay marriage, you've won this right, you've won that right, the fight for your right is over, everything's okay now. Orlando put that in a very, very different light, and I think it's a very, very important thing to understand what that means. It means that LGBT people are still oppressed massively. We still suffer in all sorts of ways that are very, very fundamental in terms of suffering and discrimination. Just in terms of the idea about being pessimistic, I'd just like to come back on that, really, because last night in Sue Caldwell's meeting, somebody said that they were actually very jealous of the younger generation that are going through at the moment, because in the last 10 years, perhaps for the first time in a lot of ways, trans people are starting to come through in schools. In my school, there have been 2 people who've transitioned in school. I've got a young group of students, 20 or 30 meet every week, and they talk about their gender fluidity, they talk about non-binary, it's become part of their language. They talk about that language and those ideas with confidence in a way that teachers in the school don't even understand the language. So that's where we are, that is where we are, and there's an issue about that. But when we think about where that is compared to the past, in fact, we're in a better position. Whatever the suffering and whatever the discrimination is going on, there is a difference now. There is a difference in terms of where things are. And I think one of the things that Laura's speech really put into context was about what happens when people fight back, and there are revolutionary waves. It's no coincidence that there was, in the 1917 and the 1920s, there was a festival of the oppressed. And there was a direct link between the fight against oppression and the fight against class society. Same in the 60s. And I think now we have to try and pull that together, and that we link the strike against the fight against the class struggle with that against oppression. And I think now, in some ways, we are in an exciting period where we can make those demands in a way that wasn't possible before. And that is what is so important about understanding that revolutionary process, that we actually make those demands. We've got a better vision of society than anyone else, and we want to see that vision come true.
Thank you. Just before the next speaker, I didn't know, comrade in the red T-shirt, did you want to speak? Did you put your hand up? Yeah, you. No, all right, cheers. Okay.
Hi, yes, I wanted to talk about the issue of the toilets of Marxism as well, because last year, when the signs went up changing the toilets of Marxism, I thought, what's that all about? People can use whatever toilet they like. This is Marxism, for God's sake, go and use it. What is that all about? And then I thought to myself afterwards, hang on a minute, why should those people have to feel like they have to, every time they walk in a toilet, open themselves up to a challenge? Why should they not just be able to use the toilet the same as anybody else and feel comfortable using that? And I think that's one of the ways that coming to Marxism educates us all, because yes, we're Marxists, yes, we're revolutionaries, but we also live in the real world where all that shit that gets put into our heads as well, and we come from that as well. And it was absolutely brilliant, because after Marxism last year, I work in a CAM service with young people, and our building is being refurbished. So I went to the managers and said, listen, what about the toilets in this new building that we're having? We don't want male and female toilets. Our young people, we have transgender young people coming in here. We have people who don't identify one way or the other, non-binary young people coming in here. And actually spoke to the management, and they went back, and they will now have toilets that just say toilets in our building, rather than identifying a gender-specific toilet. And I think, if people hadn't challenged my ideas around that at Marxism last year, and thank you to the comrades who did, and I know it was very hard for them last year when they did that initially, even at Marxism, but if they hadn't done that, the young people in Greenwich coming to the CAM service in Greenwich would have had to go through the same crap that they have to go through in the rest of the world, and why should they have to do that? So I think, we do sometimes ask stupid questions, but please bear with us, because we're trying to educate ourselves as well, because we have the shit of the world, of capitalism in our heads too, and, I run the creche right next to the non-gender specific toilet. And lots of comrades, nobody has complained about it, but people have been confused by it at times and said to me, can I use that toilet too? I'm like, well, yes, it's non-gender specific. That is a toilet. You can use the toilet. But it just shows how much the world puts into our heads and causes us to ask. So I say thank you to the comrades who forced us to question ourselves about it, and it has had a wider impact that you might know nothing about at all on other young people. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry to go back to pessimism, but I'm angry. I am angry and I am not hopeful. I'm transmasculine, my school is horrific about it, my GP, I've asked 3 different GPs at my doctors, and the head doctor has refused me 5 times for a GIC referral, then Googled what a GIC is in front of me. I know it's horrific and I'm still struggling. But I'm not hopeful. I can't talk about politics at school without 3 or 4 people commenting on my Facebook calling me an it. I don't have any respect for myself as an identity. People call me a butch lesbian. I'm like, no, I'm a guy, leave me alone. I don't have respect in everyday society. Here is fantastic, gender neutral toilets, fantastic. I can't go to Costa and pee without the barrister saying, wait, sorry, wrong toilet. I can't go to the pub and pee without saying, sorry, wrong toilet. Are you a guy? No, you're not, go away. I'm not hopeful. I want to be, and I want a trans right, and I want my own pride away from gays and corporates. Not against gays, I'm not homophobic. I mean, I want trans specific. That came out wrong. I want trans spaces, and I want people to respect me in every situation, and I'm just not hopeful. This was a fantastic talk, but there's no hope for me right now, and maybe there will be in 10 years, but I'm not going to transition until I'm at least 35 at this rate.
You're getting very used to getting microphones off of very tall things. Oh dear. The comrade who just spoke, see if you can try and go to some of the certain sexual health clinics can sometimes help you transition. I appreciate GPs can be fucking assholes. There's no if about this. We've had this problem as well. We're just trying to get GPs to just bloody refer you to the clinic in the first place, let alone getting through the bloody system. Try some things like the sexual health clinics. They use things like the gum clinic. They can be very good for you. Good luck. A couple of quick points. I've recently stopped continuing on my PGCE for health reasons, but during my first term, I was terrified because it was like, I'm trans going into school, blah, what the hell are they going to do? What's it going to be like? Because most of Manchester has been academised at this point. There are so few schools left that are not academies. And some academies have managed to sneak Section 28 style legislation back into the schools, and I didn't know whether my school had this. Thankfully, it didn't. But it was still one of those things where I got called up to the office, and I'm like, oh, blimey, what's going to go on? And then the first thing the trainee teacher organizer said was like, right, okay, so what can we do to help you? How do we do this? And at that point, it's just you just relax. It's like, oh, thank God for that. And yeah, it was fine. In the first school, it was absolutely fine. No one commented on me. No one was particularly bad to me about being trans. Some of the students make sort of some giggles and some comments, but that was actually fairly easily dealable with because the staff are on your side as well, and that sorted all the problems out. It also counteracted so many people who are always like, "Oh, save the children; they'll never understand." They do understand. Kids aren't that fucking stupid, for God's sake. Give them some credit. But yeah, no, it's one last thing as well. I don't know if any people have seen recently. Has anyone seen? Do people know about Kinder eggs? Have we seen recently how gendered Kinder eggs have got? They've split them fucking blue and pink. So okay. So one last thing, I've seen a few parents now going on at their kids going, "No, you're a boy. You can only have the blue ones. You can't have the pink princess ones." If you work in a shop and you've got the Kinder eggs, make sure you sneak them to the opposite gender child it's supposed to be for. Break the fucking system, and if you can, smash the bloody Kinder eggs and get the proper get the old bloody gender neutral ones back in. It solves so many problems. Because if you if you got the gender neutral one and you open it up and you've got a sparkly princess inside and you're a boy, you can't say a damn thing. Your mum can't say a damn thing because it was gender neutral in the first place. We have to start that campaign now.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so the last speaker is going to be after this one, and it's the woman that's just about to sit down. You're the last speaker. Sorry about that to everyone, but everyone's been called.
Hi, I'm Kieran. I'm 22. I identify as, well, I would say bisexual, but I don't feel that actually represents me. Reason being is it might have some more enlightened definitions, but it still really puts people in a box. I think that sexual and gender identity is a fantastically nuanced thing. This has parallels in medicine as well. We have things like autism, which we very much view as one thing, and it's an illness. But now we're seeing people move towards, okay, you're neuroatypical. This is a difference, not an illness. This is something that is affected by many different genetic, natural factors, some environmental as well. And the whole point is we have such incredible natural variation and range, and that we are all, every single person here, normal, even if we don't fit into a societal norm. This is natural. I don't give a damn what anyone else says. And I see very much the value in violently educating young people, affecting the environments that they grew up in from an early age, such as primary schools. Because right now, it's down to the individual teacher to say, okay, well, that story is quite unrealistic, and hey, this could be two men, or this doesn't necessarily have to be a fixed gender person, to introduce these non-hetero cis normative narratives to students. We really need to fight for gender neutrality in early education and just a much more wide range to be taught as normal and natural. We absolutely need to run around telling kids from the earliest age possible about two-spirit people, about third gender people from India before British colonialism came over there and just destroyed it like it didn't exist, practically. Yeah, absolutely educating young people, getting them to understand that the natural range of human behaviour it's so much more vast than this arbitrary little social construct we have right now, and that is just sad. So if I could say anything, coming from a college where we have a fantastic student LGBTQ society run entirely by them, they are so free compared to other educational institutes. It's get in there, teach them the natural range is not what you are taught.
Okay, I'll try and pick up on some of the points. I thought it was really, really good and honest discussion that we've had, and we need to continue that. It is contradictory, isn't it? The situation is contradictory. It's possible to recognise that we've moved forward in a whole range of ways in terms of LGBT plus rights, but the examples people gave are examples that show that we have an awful long way to go, and we need to organise, and we need to to fight back. I'll try and pick up on one or two of the specific points. Somebody raised the issue of Julie Burchill and Swansea University and the no platforming. I think I wrote something for the review about that. Sorry? No, not Julie Burchill. Oh, I'm mixing up Julie Burchill and... Sorry, Julie Burchill was another case, of course. Yes, Germaine Greer and no platforming. I think the comrade was right. I think we should not be supporting no platforming people who are radical feminists, who are arguing against trans rights. Why not? Well, because there's a negative and a positive reason. It seems to me that no platform should be restricted to those who are fascists. We should no platform fascists and fascist organisation because they are utterly anti-democratic. They want to destroy the very process of debate and discussion that we engage in. When it comes to people who have, anti-trans or whatever views, coming from a feminist perspective, I think it's actually not a good idea. I know that was what the students' organisation wanted, but I think it's not a good idea. I do think we have to kind of reserve the no platform for those who we really do need to no platform, and not just people that we very strongly disagree with. Partly because where does that lead us, and how long before we then find ourselves no platform for having views which are not acceptable to some other strands among actually this is among the oppressed, isn't it, for goodness sake. This is different oppressed groups who are confused, if you like, by an identity approach. So I think we have to be really careful about that one. And in terms of somebody mentioned safe spaces, well, yeah, actually, safe spaces are safe spaces and self-organisations is absolutely very necessary. I remember when I first started to come out, I needed to go somewhere where I could be sure that I would not be attacked, harassed, or whatever. I needed that. Loads of people need that, and that needs to be protected. Within that, of course, we need, if we're part of that, we need to be arguing about the collective, the collective nature of the resistance to oppression and who are our allies, and not go down, not sort of encourage going down a kind of a separatist route at all. So, that would be my response. Somebody else, I haven't mentioned really at all about intersex and intersex conditions and the situation intersex people find themselves in. There was actually an article in yesterday's Guardian. People may have seen it. Again, it's this emphasis upon the binary, isn't it? It's the reasons being given. Even the parents of some children were saying, what can you do? For the sake of the child, we need to make a decision to get them, allocated to one gender or another, where they're less physically. They're more clearly physically male or female, and there's a huge problem there, because that denies the person the right to make their own choice when they're old enough to make their own choice, and that is a major demand of the the intersex organisations, isn't it? That these medical interventions should not take place until the person chooses to do that, if they ever want to do that at all. So to say that's another major issue. There was clearly a debate, wasn't there, about whether we've moved forward and to what extent we move forward. And my heart goes out to the young comrade who's having a rough time at school. And I think the advice that the comrade gave about contacting the NUT is right, because actually some people find they have that support, and it's it's kind of, I won't say it's okay, but it eases the process. Other people are having an absolutely shitty time still. There is so much still to fight for. And in many ways, people talked about the gendering of eggs and so on. I mean, I'm old enough to remember going into, with my children, a long time ago, into Toys R Us and other such places, where the degree of gender differentiation between toys was actually much less than it is now. It's horrific. I have to grit my teeth. I have two young granddaughters of 4 and 5 who are just hooked on bloody Frozen and princess dresses and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not going to have the political debate with them at this point. But I do kind of raise my eyebrows at my daughter. But then she's caught up in this whole process as well, which is incredibly difficult to avoid if you are a parent. Have we moved on? Well, I think yes, we have moved on. The comrade who spoke about how different it was from the 1960s and so on. Yes, there have been those advances. Yes, that stuff can be taken away from us under certain circumstances. Therefore, it is not enough for us as an LGBT plus movement to rest on the laurels of what we have gained through the struggles. We actually have to recognise that those can be rolled back. It's absolutely fundamental that we need to recognise that from our own history of what happened in the 30s, and so on. We need to recognise that. And therefore, that does raise, it does actually raise the question. I think really kind of going back to Sylvia and that cry of rage from Sylvia that we saw in the video at the beginning. That cry of rage which is about it's not enough to satisfy. We cannot be satisfied with just rights. We have to have liberation, and that liberation, that fight for liberation, has to be on the most united basis possible. With other oppressed groups, but identifying how you change the society that we live in, and the agency for doing that. The agency that can do that is the working class, because that is the class that has its hands on power in the workplace. Fundamentally, yes, I'm actually in favour of riots. Been involved in a number of them myself, and that is fantastic. It's the cry of rage and resistance and so on. But actually, how do we change the society in the long term? How do we wrest power from that ruling class? And that has to be a revolutionary transformation. Therefore, I'd just say, finish off with anybody in the room who isn't in the SWP, I think you should join, because we have a theory about how we address questions of oppression, and we have a strategy, and we have a plan of how we are going to bring this about. It is urgent that we make this change. We're moving into times now which are even more volatile than they have, much more volatile than they have been for some time. And we need that fight. We need people involved in that fight. We need to build the links. I thought the comrade who spoke from Birmingham about linking up Muslim and LGBT plus, absolutely spot on right. We could be doing this. We could be fighting to change the nature of pride and winning more people to our perspective. And the way to do that is from inside the SWP. So if you're not a member, at least discuss it with us about joining. Thank you.